The final hollow sound of the eviction notice being taped to the door echoed in the empty apartment, a sharp, percussive crack that sealed their fate. Elena, 32, and now utterly adrift, felt the sound in her bones. A cold knot of ice tightened in her stomach, a familiar clenching of hunger and fear. The city air, thick with the ghosts of exhaust fumes and failed dreams, smelled of stale dust and finality. She ran a trembling hand over the worn kitchen counter, her fingers tracing the faint outlines where their plates used to be. All sold. Everything sold. She opened her cracked leather wallet and stared at the contents, the physical manifestation of her entire worth. 2 $100 bills, folded and softened with wear. $200. That was it. The barrier between her and the street. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She felt the burning sting of tears behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Failure was a heavy cloak, and its weight was pressing down, threatening to suffocate her. Her gaze fell upon her son, Leo, sleeping on a thin pile of blankets in the corner, the only soft place left in their world. He was 7, and his small face, illuminated by the cold blue light of a distant street lamp, was peaceful, blissfully unaware of the chasm that had opened beneath them. A wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over Elena, immediately followed by a surge of crippling guilt. His chest rose and fell in a steady, trusting rhythm. She knelt beside him, the cold of the bare floor seeping through her jeans, and gently brushed a strand of sandy hair from his forehead, her stomach twisted with a nausea born of pure terror. How could she protect him from this? Beside him lay his most cherished possession, a small wooden soldier, a gift from a happier time. Its leg was snapped clean off, the bright red paint of its uniform chipped and faded. The tiny, painted-on smile seemed like a cruel mockery. She picked it up, the splintered wood rough against her fingertips, a broken toy for a broken life. It was a small, stupid thing, but it felt like the final, unbearable symbol of her inability to hold their world together. The silence of the night was a crushing weight, broken only by the distant, mournful wail of a siren, a sound that belonged to a city that had already spit them out. Elena felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Her phone lay dark on the floor, the screen a black mirror reflecting her own exhausted face. The last few desperate messages to Leo's father remained unanswered, swallowed by a void of indifference. He was a ghost, a half-forgotten memory who had left nothing behind but a son he would never know, and a hole in their lives that could never be filled. She felt a familiar, bitter resentment rise in her throat, but it was quickly smothered by a profound weariness. There was no one to call, no family to turn to for shelter. She had been so proud, so determined to make it on her own after she was laid off from the garment factory, the scent of machine oil and hot fabric replaced by the stink of poverty. That pride had turned to ash in her mouth. She wrapped her arms around herself, a useless shield against the cold. No one was coming. The realization was not a shock, but a dull, leaden certainty that settled deep in her soul. Her eyes landed on a crumpled, yellowed envelope on the floor, a piece of mail she had almost thrown away months ago, a letter from a lawyer in a town she'd never heard of. It spoke of a forgotten inheritance, a house left to her by a great aunt she had never met, a name that was just a whisper from her own mother's childhood stories. At the time, it had seemed like a bizarre piece of junk mail. Now, it was a lifeline, or a noose. She didn't know which. A fragile, terrifying sliver of a plan began to form in her mind, born not of hope, but of sheer animal desperation. A roof. It was a roof, free of rent, a place to escape the crushing weight of the city. Her hands trembled as she smoothed out the letter, her eyes scanning the dry, formal words. The name of the town felt alien on her tongue, a place at the edge of the map. With a deep, shuddering breath, she made the decision. She used her phone's dying battery to look up bus tickets, $32.50, a significant wound to her meager funds, but it was the only way forward. Fair cold sweat prickled the back of her neck. She was trading a familiar hell for one she couldn't even imagine. Before the sun had even begun to cast its grey light over the city, they were standing on the curb, a single, patched-up suitcase between them. Leo, still groggy with sleep, clutched his broken wooden soldier, his small knuckles white. Eleanor took one last look at the apartment building, a brick-and-glass tomb of their former life, and felt nothing but a vast, hollow numbness. A single, cold tear finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. The lump in her throat was so tight she could barely swallow. She took Leo's hand, the smallness of it both a comfort and a terrible burden. $167.50. The number chanted in her head like a funeral dirge. The guttural rumble of the bus approaching sounded monstrous, like a beast coming to swallow them whole. As they stepped aboard, the hiss of the hydraulic doors closing behind them was a sound of absolute finality. They were not just leaving an apartment, they were leaving the world they knew, plunging into a deep, uncertain darkness, with nothing but the weight of their past and the clothes on their backs. They were leaving, for good. The droning hum of the bus engine was a monotonous lullaby of escape, a sound that vibrated through the worn-out seat and deep into Elena's bones. For hours, she watched the world transform through the grimy window. The sharp concrete angles of the city blurred and bled into sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into the soft, rolling green of the countryside. A fragile, desperate hope had begun to take root in the barren soil of her heart. A house, a roof that was theirs, no rent, no eviction notices taped to the door like a death warrant. It was a blank canvas, she told herself, a place to start over. She could almost smell the warm, comforting scent of hot fabric and hear the steady whir of a sewing machine. A small business taking shape in a clean, sunlit room. Her stomach still ached with a dull hunger, but for the first time in months, the gnawing anxiety was tempered by this thin, shimmering mirage of a future. She clutched the idea of it like a drowning woman clutches a piece of driftwood, a desperate, precarious salvation. Leo, silent beside her, pressed his face against the cool glass, his breath fogging a small circle on the pane. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left, his small world upended with a brutality he couldn't possibly comprehend. Elena felt a fresh pang of guilt, a sharp, twisting blade in her gut. She had promised him things would get better, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. Now, everything depended on this one. Single gamble, the inheritance. A word that sounded so grand, so full of promise. It conjured images of a quaint country cottage, perhaps a little neglected but solid, something she could fix, something she could pour her broken spirit into and rebuild, just as she would rebuild their lives. She imagined a small garden, Leo playing in the yard, the broken wooden soldier forgotten in a box of new, better toys. The hope was so potent, so intoxicating, that she allowed herself to believe in it completely. She had to. The alternative was an abyss she couldn't bear to look into. The bus ride was a journey not just across miles, but across a fragile bridge of fantasy. The bus slowed, its air brakes hissing with a sound of weary finality. The driver, a man with a tired face and kind eyes, called out the name of the town, a name that sounded foreign and insignificant. "This is it, ma'am. End of the line." He gestured vaguely towards a dusty, unpaved road that vanished into a dense thicket of trees. There was no station, no town square, nothing but the road, a rusty mailbox, and an oppressive, humming silence. Elena's heart gave a single, hard thud against her ribs. She thanked the driver, her voice a dry whisper, and stepped down onto the gravel shoulder. The sudden heat of the rural afternoon, a physical blow. Leo followed, his hand immediately finding hers. They stood there, two small, lost figures under a vast, empty sky, the sound of the bus engine fading into the distance, leaving a quiet so profound it felt like a weight on her eardrums. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, something wild and vaguely unsettling. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone, and the first crack appeared in her carefully constructed hope. They walked for what felt like miles, the worn-out wheels of their single suitcase rattling over the stones and ruts of the dirt road. The sun beat down on the back of Elena's neck, and sweat trickled between her shoulder blades. The woods pressed in on either side, tall and dark, the trees so thick they seemed to swallow the sunlight. The sounds were alien to her city ears, the shrill buzz of unseen insects, the rustle of leaves that sounded too much like furtive footsteps, the distant, lonely cry of a crow. Her flimsy city shoes were no match for the terrain, and a blister was already forming on her heel. The physical discomfort was a sharp counterpoint to the growing dread that was coiling in her stomach. The lawyer's directions had seemed so simple on paper, but out here, in this sprawling, indifferent wilderness, they felt like a cruel joke. Every step took them deeper into isolation, further away from anything that felt like civilization or safety. The fragile dream of a quaint cottage was fading fast, replaced by a raw, primitive fear. She squeezed Leo's hand, her own palm slick with sweat. Then she saw it. Set back from the road, almost entirely consumed by a tangle of thorny vines and overgrown weeds, stood the house. It wasn't a cottage. It was a ruin, a dark, sagging structure that seemed to groan under the weight of its own decay. The porch roof drooped at a sickening angle, held up by a single, rotted post. Windows were boarded up or stared out like vacant, shattered eyes. The paint, what little remained of it, was a ghostly, peeling grey, revealing the dark, damp-stained wood beneath. A wave of nausea rose in Elena's throat. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a blank canvas, it was a tombstone. The hope that had sustained her throughout the journey shattered into a million pieces, the sound of it echoing in the crushing silence of the woods. She felt her legs grow weak, a dizzying sense of vertigo washing over her. This couldn't be it. It was a mistake. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. She had gambled their last dollar, their last shred of dignity, on this forgotten, rotting carcass of a house. This was their new home. Leo stopped walking, his small body frozen. He looked from the house to his mother's face, and his own expression crumpled. He didn't need to ask. He could feel the despair radiating from her like a cold wave. Elena forced herself to move, her feet feeling like lead weights. The rusted iron gate shrieked in protest as she pushed it open, the sound scraping against her raw nerves. The path to the front door was barely visible, choked with weeds as tall as her waist. As she drew closer, the smell hit her. It wasn't the fresh, earthy scent of the woods anymore. It was the smell of rot, a deep, pervasive stench of mildew, damp decay, and the faint, sweetish odor of dead things. It clung to the air, thick and cloying, and she had to fight the urge to gag. Her dream of a sewing business, of a sunlit room and a happy child, seemed like a fever dream, a cruel fantasy from another lifetime. She had not found a sanctuary. She had led her son into a grave. A sob, hot and ragged, caught in her throat. She swallowed it down, the effort of physical pain. The key, old and rusted, felt cold and skeletal in her trembling hand. It took several tries before it turned in the lock, the mechanism grinding with a sound of long disuse. The heavy wooden door swung inward on groaning hinges, opening into a maw of absolute darkness. A blast of stale as cold air rushed out to meet them, carrying the smell of decay with renewed intensity. Elena fumbled for a light switch, her fingers sliding over a damp, peeling wall, but found nothing. The only light was the weak grey illumination from the doorway, which revealed a scene of utter devastation. Dust lay in thick, felted layers over everything, disturbed only by the frantic tracks of mice. Cobwebs, heavy and ancient, hung from the ceiling like funeral shrouds. In the center of the main room, a large, dark stain on the floor marked where the leaky roof had been dripping for years, the steady plink, plink, plink of water falling into a puddle, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. Her heart, which had been hammering with anxiety, now seemed to slow, sinking into a cold, bottomless pit of despair. She took a hesitant step inside, the floorboards groaning ominously under her weight. Her eyes slowly adjusted, and the full scope of the ruin became clear. The wallpaper, once a floral pattern, was now a tapestry of water stains and black mold, peeling away from the walls in long, curling strips. A sofa and armchair, their stuffing bursting from ripped upholstery, sat like dead, bloated animals in the gloom. Everything felt damp to the touch, a permanent, seeping chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Elena ran a hand over a tabletop, and it came away coated in a thick, greasy film of grime. She felt a tremor run through her body, a violent shiver of revulsion and sheer, hopeless terror. This place wasn't just neglected. It felt diseased. It felt actively malevolent, as if the decades of decay had given it a life of its own, a silent, waiting hunger. The city apartment, with its eviction notice and empty cupboards, seemed like a palace in comparison. At least there, the dangers were familiar. Here they were unknown, hidden in the shadows and the rot. Leo clung to her leg, his face buried in the fabric of her jeans, refusing to look. She could feel his small body trembling. "Mommy, I don't like it here," he whispered, his voice muffled and thick with fear. "It smells bad." The simple, childish observation was a dagger to Elena's heart. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What had she done? What kind of mother brought her child to a place like this? She had promised him a home, and she had given him this nightmare. She knelt, her knees cracking in the cold, and wrapped her arms around him, but it was a hollow gesture. She had no comfort to offer. Her own terror was a frantic, screaming thing inside her head. Her vision swam, the dark shapes of the room blurring at the edges. She had failed, completely and irrevocably. There was no going back. The last of their money was gone. There was no one to call. This was it, the absolute end of the line, the bottom of the world. And it was dark. And it was cold, and it was rotting all around them. The lawyer's letter had mentioned a basement. Perhaps a desperate, foolish part of her brain whispered it was dry, a place to store their single suitcase, to escape the oppressive damp of the main floor. She found the door tucked away in a dark corner off the kitchen, a simple, unpainted plank of wood with an iron ring for a handle. Pulling it open revealed a flight of steep, stone steps descending into an even more profound blackness. The air that rose from the opening was different. It was colder, a deep, cellar-chilled air, and the smell of mildew was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of stone and cold earth. A flicker of hope, so faint it was almost painful, sparked within her. She guided Leo to sit on the least ruined chair, his broken soldier clutched in his hand, and told him to wait, her voice strained and falsely cheerful. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she started her descent, one hand trailing against the damp, rough-hewn stone wall for balance. The steps were uneven and slick with a fine layer of grit. The temperature dropped with every step she took. It was a biting cold that seemed to leach the warmth directly from her skin. The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety black that her eyes couldn't penetrate. It felt ancient, heavy, a silence that was older and deeper than the quiet upstairs. When her foot touched the flat, stone floor at the bottom, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold racked her body. She waited, letting her eyes strain against the gloom, hoping for some faint source of light. There was none. She could hear her own breathing, loud and ragged in the stillness. She could hear the frantic drumming of her own pulse in her ears, but that was all. The space around her felt vast and empty. There were no sounds of scurrying vermin, no drip of water, just a dead, sterile silence. The profound emptiness of it was more terrifying than the decay upstairs. It was a void. A barren stone box buried beneath a rotting house in the middle of a hostile wilderness. It was a perfect, physical metaphor for her life. She stood there in the center of the cold, dark emptiness, and something inside her finally broke. The carefully constructed walls of her composure, eroded by months of failure and fear, finally crumbled into dust. A low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of pure animal despair. It wasn't a sob or a cry, but a raw, hopeless moan. She had dragged her son across the country, spent their last dollar, abandoned the last vestiges of their old life, all for this, for a rotting shell of a house and an empty, tomb-like cellar. The isolation was absolute. The failure was complete. She sank to her knees on the cold stone floor, the sharp grit pressing into her jeans. The cold seeped into her, a deep, internal chill that extinguished the last, dying ember of hope. Tears, hot and silent, finally began to stream down her face, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, which was clenched in a tight, painful knot of hunger and dread. She had made a terrible, terrible mistake, and now she and her son were trapped in it. The despair was a physical presence, a heavy cloak that smothered her. She had never felt so alone, so utterly defeated. Every decision she had made had led her to this exact moment, kneeling in the dark, in a cold stone basement, in a house that was falling down around her, with a terrified child upstairs and no way out. The weight of her responsibility to Leo was a crushing, unbearable burden. She had not only failed to protect him, she had actively led him into greater danger. into a deeper poverty, into a more profound isolation. The musty air tasted of dirt and finality. She felt a wave of dizziness, the darkness of the basement seeming to press in on her, to spin around her. Her breathing became shallow, her heart thudding with a dull, heavy beat. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. She had hit the cold, hard stone floor of rock bottom, and she had no idea how they would ever get up again. The silence of the cellar offered no answers, only a cold, empty echo of her own desolation. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, a lonely, mundane sound that cut through Elena's stupor. Leo. He was up there, alone, waiting for her. The thought was a splash of icy water. She couldn't fall apart. Not here. Not now. She had to be the mother. She had to be the protector, even if she felt like a child herself. Lost and terrified in the dark. With a monumental effort, she pushed herself up, her joints aching from the cold. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced them to move. She ran a hand over her wet face, wiping away the tears and the dirt. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach, but a new feeling was hardening around it, a grim, bitter resolve. This was their reality now. This was the hand they had been dealt. She didn't know what she was going to do, how they were going to eat or how they would survive in this ruin. But as she began the slow climb back up the stone steps, out of the absolute darkness and back into the decaying gloom, she knew one thing. She would not let this place be their grave. The climb out of the basement felt symbolic, a struggle out of the abyss she had fallen into. When her head emerged into the kitchen, the grey light seemed almost blindingly bright. Leo was still sitting where she left him, his small face pale, his eyes wide. He was holding the broken wooden soldier, his thumb rubbing over the splintered leg. He looked so small, so fragile, a tiny island of innocence in a sea of decay. Seeing him, the fierce, protective love she felt for him surged, a hot, powerful current that burned away some of the cold despair. She went to him and knelt, pulling him into a tight hug. She buried her face in his hair, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of him. "It's okay," she whispered, the lie feeling heavy and wrong on her tongue. "We're going to be okay." But as she held her son, her gaze drifted past him to the crumbling walls, the peeling wallpaper, and the steady, maddening plink, plink, plink of the dripping water. A new, colder fear began to settle in her heart. This house wasn't just a ruin. It felt like it was waiting for them. The first night in the house was a descent into a new kind of hell. The air, thick with the ghosts of mildew and neglect, was bitingly cold. Elena and Leo huddled together on the dusty floorboards of the main room, their two thin coats a pathetic shield against the damp chill that seeped up from the very foundation of the building. Sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind that rattled the boarded-up windows sounded like a hand scratching to get in. The ancient timber of the house groaned and settled around them, a constant symphony of decay that grated on Elena's raw nerves. Leo, shivering beside her, clutched his broken wooden soldier, the small, splintered toy, a mirror of their shattered circumstances. Elena wrapped her arms around him, feeling the frantic, frightened beat of his small heart against her own. Hopelessness was a physical presence in the room, a suffocating blanket heavier than any they owned. She had never felt so cold, or so completely and utterly alone in the crushing darkness. Leo could not settle. The oppressive gloom and the house's constant, unsettling noises fed a terror that made his small body tremble. In the city, the sounds had been familiar. Sirens, traffic, the distant hum of life. Here the sounds were organic, secret, and full of menace. In a moment of quiet, childish despair, he slipped away from Elena's side. He felt drawn to the one place that seemed even colder and emptier than his own heart, the basement. Creeping to the dark doorway, he stared down into the absolute blackness. He wasn't afraid of it anymore. He felt a kinship with its sterile void. With a small choked sob, he placed his broken wooden soldier on the top step, then nudged it with his toe. It tumbled down the stone stairs, the small clattering sound swallowed by the immense silence. He left it there. On the cold stone floor at the bottom, a tiny, broken thing abandoned in the vast, empty dark. A fitting tribute to how he felt, broken and left behind. Elena, lost in her own vortex of fear and regret, didn't notice him slip away at first. The creak of a floorboard snapped her back to the present. "Leo," she whispered into the dark. She found him standing at the threshold of the basement, his small silhouette framed against the deeper blackness. His face was pale and streaked with tears. She gently coaxed him away from the door, her heart aching with a fresh wave of guilt. She didn't ask about the toy, she just held him close and guided him back to their makeshift bed on the floor. They lay there for hours, sleep coming only in short, fitful bursts. Elena's dreams were a chaotic slideshow of failure. The landlord's sneering face, the bus pulling away without them, the image of Leo's face getting smaller and smaller in the distance. Each time she woke, her heart was a frantic drum in her chest, her ears straining to decipher the house's terrifying language of creaks and groans. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence. The next morning, Elena awoke to a body stiff with cold and a spirit heavy with dread. A single, weak beam of sunlight cut through a grimy window, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. It was a small, almost beautiful sight in the midst of so much ugliness. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her joints protesting. The first order of business was to find the source of the dripping water she'd heard all night, the steady plink, plink, plink that had sounded like a maddening form of water torture. As her eyes scanned the room, they fell upon the rickety kitchen table, bathed in that single shaft of light, and she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, impossibly, was the wooden soldier. It wasn't lying on its side, broken. It was standing at perfect attention, gleaming in the morning light, its posture proud and its form complete. Her mind simply refused to process what she was seeing. A chilling wave of adrenaline washed through her. This was wrong, this was impossible. She rose slowly, her bare feet silent on the dusty floorboards, approaching the table as if it were a booby trap. It was Leo's soldier, there was no doubt, but it was transformed. The broken leg had been seamlessly reattached, leaving no trace of a crack or seam. More than that, it had been painstakingly restored. The faded red of its uniform was now a vibrant, glossy crimson. The chipped black paint of its tiny boots was a deep, lustrous black. Even the small, painted-on smile had been repainted with an artist's delicate precision. A shiver, born of pure, superstitious dread, traced a cold path up her spine. This place, this house, it wasn't just empty. It wasn't just decaying. Something was here with them. Something that could perform miracles on a broken toy. Her hands trembling, she gently picked up the soldier. It felt solid, whole. She turned and went to Leo, who was still curled asleep on the floor. She knelt beside him and shook his shoulder softly. "Leo," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. "Honey, wake up." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. She held out the toy. "Leo, did you do this? Did you fix him?" Leo's eyes, still clouded with sleep, slowly focused on the soldier in her hand. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. A huge grin spread across his face. "He's better. Mommy, he's all better." He grabbed the toy, hugging it to his chest, completely overjoyed. He shook his head, confirming her fears. He hadn't done it. Of course he hadn't. There was no glue, no paint, no tools, no skill. They had been asleep in a locked, rotting house. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. It was utterly, terrifyingly impossible. The impossible event hung in the air, shifting the very atmosphere of the house. The ruin, which had been a symbol of her failure, now felt menacingly alive. It wasn't just old. It was occupied. Elena's rational mind desperately searched for an explanation. A bizarre prank, a squatter, anything. But her gut screamed a different truth. This wasn't a human act. The perfection of the repair, the absence of any tools or materials, it felt like a whisper from another world. The fear was a cold, constricting band around her chest, but beneath it, a new emotion began to smolder, an intense, undeniable curiosity. This was not an act of decay. It was an act of creation. It felt deliberate. It felt like a message. But who was the sender? And what were they trying to say? The house had their attention now. It was no longer a passive backdrop to their misery. It was a character in their story, and it had just spoken its first impossible word. Her mind rewound to the night before. The soldier, broken, Leo, upset, his small, tear-streaked face at the basement door, the abyss. A sudden, chilling thought pierced through her fear. She knelt beside Leo, her voice carefully casual. "Sweetheart, where did you leave your soldier last night before he got fixed?" Leo, still admiring the toy's new coat of paint, pointed a small finger towards the dark corner of the kitchen. "Down there," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I dropped him down the stairs. I was sad." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. The basement, the cold, empty, sterile heart of the house. The place she had hit rock bottom. The source of this impossible magic, this unsettling miracle, had come from that black, silent void. She had felt nothing but despair down there, but she had been wrong. Something else had been there with her, waiting in the dark. A new kind of resolve, forged in a crucible of fear and fascination, solidified within her. She had to go back down. She was no longer descending into a pit of her own failure, but into the heart of a profound mystery. She rummaged through their single suitcase and found a small, cheap flashlight, its plastic casing cracked. Its beam would be weak, but it was better than nothing. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did little to steady her nerves, she pulled open the heavy plank door. The same cold, earthy air rushed out to meet her. "Stay here, Leo. Don't move," she commanded, her voice firmer than she felt. She switched on the flashlight, and its pale, trembling circle of light cut a nervous path into the oppressive blackness. One step at a time, she descended again into the cold and the quiet. But this time, she was not running from something. She was hunting for it. She was looking for an answer. The weak beam of the flashlight swept across the barren stone floor of the basement. It was just as she remembered it, vast, empty, and silent. She moved the unsteady circle of light to the area at the bottom of the stairs, where the soldier must have landed. There was nothing, just bare, cold flagstones covered in a fine layer of dust and grit. She knelt, her fingers tracing the cracks in the stone. There were no drops of paint, no wood shavings, no trace of glue or varnish, no evidence whatsoever that any kind of work had been performed there. The absolute absence of evidence was, in itself, damning proof of the impossibility. Her breath hitched. Her gaze lifted from the floor and began a slow, meticulous sweep of the walls. Rough-hewn stones, fitted together with ancient mortar, rose into the darkness above her. The narrow beam crept over the damp, weeping surface, revealing nothing but grime and the delicate, dusty lacework of cobwebs. She started her search from the spot on the floor, moving the flashlight beam up the wall in a slow, deliberate pattern. She was looking for anything. A crack, a loose piece of mortar, a stain, anything that broke the pattern of uniform, ancient decay. The stones were all the same shade of damp grey, slick with condensation, indistinguishable from one another. It was a solid wall of forgotten history. But then the light wavered and caught on a subtle anomaly. About waist-high, nestled between two larger stones, was a single block that seemed different. It was the same color, the same size, but the mortar joint around it was cleaner, sharper. It lacked the crumbling, dusty texture of the surrounding seams. It was an almost imperceptible detail, but in this homogeneous expanse of stone, it was as loud as a shout. Her pulse quickened. It was a flaw in the facade, a patch, a secret. A jolt of adrenaline shot through her. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers cold and numb, and pressed against the stone. It was solid, unmoving. She pushed harder, putting her shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge. A wave of frustration and doubt washed over her. Was she just seeing things? Was her desperate mind inventing patterns in the dark? She refused to give up. She ran her fingernails along the clean mortar line, probing for weakness, and then she felt it. A tiny fissure near the bottom edge, barely wider than a hair. Hope surged. She fished in her pocket for a coin, her fingers clumsy with excitement. Using the edge of a quarter, she began to scrape at the mortar. It was different. It didn't resist like stone, but flaked away in a fine powder, like dry clay. Someone had sealed this stone with something weaker than cement. It was made to be opened. The work was slow and agonizing. Crouched in the cold dark, scraping with a coin, her fingers quickly grew raw and her back began to ache in protest. The fine dust got in her nose and throat, but she didn't stop. With each flake of mortar she removed, her determination grew. Finally, After what felt like an hour, she had cleared a deep enough groove around the stone. She wedged her raw fingertips into the gap and pulled. The stone resisted, locked in place by decades of inertia. She repositioned her feet, took a deep breath, and heaved with all her strength. There was a low, grating scrape of stone against stone, a sound that vibrated through the floor. It moved. It was loose. With a final, guttural cry of effort, she pulled the stone free from the wall. It was heavier than she expected, and she stumbled back, setting it carefully on the ground. Where the stone had been was a perfectly cut rectangular void, a hidden chamber, a safe made of stone, concealed in the heart of the house. A plume of cold, stale air, different from the cellar air, billowed out of the dark opening. It carried an ancient, forgotten scent, the dry, delicate aroma of old leather and brittle paper. She froze, her hand hovering over the cavity, a war raging within her. The primal fear of the unknown urged her to push the stone back, to run, to forget she ever saw it. But the powerful magnetic pull of the mystery was stronger. The repaired soldier wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. She had to know. Taking a shallow breath, she aimed the weak flashlight beam into the hole. The light glinted off something dark and smooth. Reaching in, her arm disappearing into the wall up to her elbow, her fingers brushed against the unmistakable texture of worn, supple leather. It was a book. With a surge of excitement, she gripped it and pulled it free. She carried it over to where she had set the flashlight on the floor, its beam pointing at the ceiling, creating a dim, ambient glow. The object she held was a small, beautifully made book, bound in dark brown leather that was worn smooth with time and handling. There was no title on the cover, no markings at all. It was utterly anonymous. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The pages inside were thick and creamy, filled from edge to edge with a dense, elegant, cursive script. The ink had faded from black to a rusty brown over the long years. She squinted, trying to decipher the words, but the language was completely alien to her. It was full of sharp, angular letters and unfamiliar umlauts. With a jolt, she recognized it from old war movies. It was German. A diary, a hidden diary written in German. Her mind reeled with questions. Who was this person? And why did they feel the need to hide their private thoughts inside a solid stone wall? Her curiosity overpowering her caution, she reached back into the dark cavity. Her questing fingers brushed against other objects, these ones small, cold, and metallic. She drew them out one by one and lined them up on the stone floor beside the diary. They were toys, but of a kind she had never seen before, not even in the most expensive city shops. They were tiny, intricate clockwork automata. There was a little bird, its wings made of delicate silver filigree. There was a miniature ballerina, frozen mid-pirouette, in a tiny metal dress. There was a carousel, no bigger than her palm, with microscopic horses that looked ready to dance. They were silent and still, but they radiated a sense of dormant life, of genius and patience. The craftsmanship was breathtaking, and it echoed the same impossible perfection she had seen in Leo's repaired soldier. The connection clicked into place in her mind with the force of a revelation. The soldier, these exquisite clockwork toys, it was all the work of the same person. The same brilliant, meticulous hand had fixed Leo's simple toy and crafted these mechanical marvels. A ghost, she thought, a ghost in the machine of the house, but not a terrifying spectre. This was the spirit of an artist, a toy maker. A master of his craft had lived in this very house, had worked in this very basement, and had hidden his most beautiful creations away from the world. The cold fear that had gripped her began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of awe and a deep, nagging question that echoed the one in her mind about the diary. Why hide such beauty? What was he afraid of? This wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary and a prison. Her hand went back into the hole one last time, her fingers sweeping the cold stone interior to ensure it was empty. Deep in the back, her fingertips brushed against something else, tucked away as if it were the most important piece of all. It felt like paper, but thick and stiff, folded into a tight packet. She carefully worked it out of the narrow space, her heart thudding with a new kind of anticipation. It was a bundle of old documents, tied together with a faded blue ribbon that was so brittle it threatened to crumble at her touch. She handled them with the reverence one would give a sacred text, terrified they might disintegrate in her hands. These felt different from the diary and the toys. They felt official, They felt dangerous. This, she sensed, was the real reason for the hiding place. Kneeling on the cold floor, she carefully untied the ribbon. The old silk broke apart between her fingers. She unfolded the topmost document, the stiff parchment crackling in protest. It was an official paper, covered in the dense, typed language of lawyers and bureaucrats, adorned with elaborate, faded stamps. Most of it was incomprehensible, but she was able to pick out key much electrifying phrases in English: deed of title, official registrar, Oak Creek County, and then a name, Klaus Reinhardt, followed by a date, 1946. Her eyes widened as she scanned the rest of the text. It was a legal deed for a massive parcel of land described in the arcane language of metes and bounds. It wasn't for the small, worthless plot her house sat on. It was for the vast, surrounding forest, a forest rich with timber, a forest that she had been told belonged to someone else entirely. Her hands shook as she unfolded the other documents. They were all the same: more deeds, detailed survey maps, and official registration papers, all legally filed and stamped in 1946. All of them granted ownership of the hundreds of acres of adjacent forest land to this man, Klaus Reinhardt. According to the lawyer who had handled her meager inheritance, her property consisted of the house and a single, useless acre of overgrown yard. But these documents, original, authentic, and hidden for over 70 years, told a radically different story. They suggested that the true owner of this house was also the rightful owner of a fortune in timber. And since she had inherited the house from her great-aunt, a name she now suspected was connected to Klaus Reinhardt, that fortune now belonged to her. The sheer scale of the implication was staggering. She sat back on her heels on the cold stone floor, the world spinning before her. In the weak halo of the flashlight lay the pieces of a life's puzzle, a secret diary, a collection of magical toys, and legal proof of ownership to an immense fortune. The soul-crushing despair that had defined her existence just hours ago evaporated, burned away by a wildfire of questions and a shocking, terrifying new form of hope. This house wasn't a tomb, it was a treasure chest. And the ghost of a long-dead toymaker had just given her the key. The chill of the basement no longer felt like death. It felt electric, humming with the energy of a long-dormant secret finally coming to light. Her world had not ended here. It was about to begin. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was now the guardian of a story and a fortune. With deliberate, careful movements, she began to gather the treasure, the heavy diary, the cold, intricate toys, and the brittle, priceless deeds. This secret felt immense and dangerous. People did not go to such lengths to hide things unless they were running from something or someone. This was not a secret she could share. Not yet. She returned to the wall and, with a grunt of effort, lifted the heavy stone back into its cavity. The scrape of it sliding into place was a sound of finality, of a pact being sealed. The secret was hidden once more, but now she was on the inside. Back upstairs in the decaying gloom, she hid everything at the very bottom of her suitcase, burying it beneath their few worn clothes. The weight of the leather-bound book felt immense, a tangible secret that she now carried on her own shoulders. Everything looked different now. As she stood in the center of the main room, the house no longer seemed like an enemy. The peeling wallpaper, the water-stained ceilings, the groaning floorboards, they weren't just signs of rot and decay anymore. They were the loyal, silent guardians of a 70-year-old story. This house had protected Klaus Reinhardt's legacy, waiting for someone to arrive who was desperate enough to listen to its whispers. The steady plink, plink of the dripping water no longer sounded like a countdown to collapse, but like the ticking of a clock that had just been restarted. Her entire purpose had been rewritten. It was no longer about simple, day-to-day survival. It was about uncovering the truth. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming a stolen life. She knew, with absolute clarity, what her first step had to be. The diary. The story began and ended with Klaus Reinhardt. The German diary held the key to understanding who the toymaker was, why he had hidden his fortune, and what he had been so afraid of. She needed a translator. The thought was daunting. In this tiny, isolated town where she knew no one and was regarded with suspicion, how could she possibly find someone she could trust with a secret of this magnitude? The challenge felt immense, but it no longer felt impossible. The discovery in the basement had ignited a fire in her, a core of steel she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a failed seamstress anymore. She was an investigator. She had a mission for the ghost of the toy maker, for her son, and for herself. That evening, as a sliver of moon cast a pale, ethereal glow over the dark, whispering woods, Elena cleared a space on the dusty mantelpiece above the cold, cavernous fireplace. She took the perfectly repaired wooden soldier and stood it there, a solitary guardian in the gloom. It stood at attention, its new paint gleaming softly in the moonlight. It was no longer a sad symbol of their broken lives. It was now a promise, a symbol of impossible restoration, of hidden strength. It was a sign that even in the deepest darkness, in the most hopeless of ruins, things that were long broken could be made whole again. A shiver ran down her spine as she looked at it, a feeling not of fear but of a strange and powerful alliance with the silent, watchful spirit of the house itself. The game had changed. The mystery had begun. The diary was a physical weight in her suitcase, its worn leather cover a constant, silent accusation. She needed it translated, but the thought of trusting a stranger with a secret this colossal was a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. The nearby town was a small, closed-off place. A single main street with a post office, a general store, and a sheriff's office that looked sleepy and permanent. Everyone seemed to know everyone, their glances lingering on her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She was an outsider, a city stray who had washed up in their quiet world. She felt their eyes on her back as she bought bread and milk, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins. Asking for a German translator here felt like announcing she had found a treasure map. The fear of exposing the secret and herself was a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. She felt utterly, dangerously conspicuous, a lone figure walking on a fragile sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake. Desperate. She spent a precious few dollars at a payphone EWE. The cold plastic receiver pressed hard against her ear. She called the history department of a small college in the next county over, her voice a strained whisper. She explained she had found some old family letters. The department secretary, a bored-sounding woman, gave her the name of a retired professor, a Dr. Albright, who lived just an hour's bus ride away. "He's an expert in 20th century European manuscripts," the woman had said, her tone implying he was also an eccentric recluse. The decision to go felt like a terrifying gamble. She was taking her one precious clue and exposing it to the world, armed with nothing but a flimsy lie about family letters. As she held the diary, wrapped in a threadbare towel at the bottom of her bag, she felt the toy maker's ghost at her shoulder, questioning her, trusting her, his entire legacy resting in her trembling hands. The weight of it was almost unbearable. The bus dropped her in a larger, but still quiet, town. Professor Albright's house was a small brick bungalow buried under an avalanche of overgrown ivy, books visible in precarious stacks through every window. The air inside smelled of dust, aging paper, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco. The professor himself was a small, bird-like man with kind, watery eyes behind thick spectacles. He listened to her story about family letters with polite disinterest, his fingers steepled under his chin. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, the sound a frantic drum in the silent, dusty room. She felt like an imposter, a child playing a dangerous game with adults. The lie felt thin and transparent, and she was sure he could see right through her, see the raw desperation and the monumental secret she was hiding. A wave of nausea washed over her. Maybe this was a mistake, a terrible, reckless mistake she would live to regret. She unwrapped the diary and placed it on his cluttered desk, the dark leather stark against a sea of scattered papers. The professor's expression changed. He leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued. He picked it up with a reverence that calmed Elena's frayed nerves, his gnarled fingers tracing the cover. "This is not a letter," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "This is a journal. The binding is German, mid-1940s. Beautiful craftsmanship." He opened it, his eyes scanning the elegant, faded script. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of the turning pages and the frantic thud of Elena's own heart. "The penmanship is remarkable," he said, finally looking up at her. The writer was an educated man, an artist, I think. He agreed to translate a few key sections for a modest fee. his initial disinterest replaced by a genuine, academic fascination. Elena felt a flicker of hope, but it was tangled with a deep, chilling premonition. 2 days later, the phone in the general store rang, the shrill, jarring sound echoing in the quiet space. It was for her. Professor Albright's voice on the other end was different, stripped of its academic calm. It was low, urgent, and heavy with a gravity that made the hair on Elena's arms stand on end. "Mrs. Girl, your family history is more complex than you let on," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. He began to read. The words, filtered through the static of the line, were like dispatches from another world. October 12th, 1946. "We have arrived. After so much darkness, America feels like a waking dream. The air is clean, free of the ash and ghosts of Europe. I have used what we salvaged to purchase the forest. A new life for my little Anya. A kingdom of trees and quiet for her to grow in. We are safe now, we are finally safe." Elena squeezed her eyes shut, leaning against the wall of the phone booth, the image of a hopeful father and his little girl suddenly painfully vivid. A cold dread began to seep into her bones as the professor continued reading, his voice a somber eulogy. The diary entries shifted, the initial tone of relief and hope souring into suspicion and fear. November 3rd, 1946. "The local baron, a man named Abernathy, visited today. He has eyes like a wolf, and a smile that does not reach them. He looks at my trees with a hunger that chills me to the bone. He offered to buy the land for a pittance, laughing when I refused. He said a foreigner like me doesn't understand how things work here." The name hit Elena like a physical blow. Abernathy, the powerful local family who, according to the store owner, owned everything for miles around. Owned the timber mill, owned the town. The ghost story was beginning to intersect with the present in the most terrifying way. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. This was no longer history. This was a living, breathing threat. The professor's voice dropped even lower, thick with the weight of the story he was unearthing. "Elena," he said, using her real name for the first time. "This man, Klaus Reinhardt, he was not just a landowner. He was a Jewish toymaker from Berlin. He and his family escaped the Nazis in 1945. The diary speaks of his wife's family jewels, a fortune in uncut diamonds they smuggled out, sewn into the lining of a coat. He calls them the Tears of Starlight. He used a portion of them to legally purchase all that land, filing every deed, every survey. He was building a new life from the ashes of the old." Elena's blood ran cold. The sheer scale of the injustice was breathtaking. Klaus Reinhardt hadn't just been a landowner, he had been a survivor. A refugee who had found a sanctuary only to stumble into a new predator's den. The exquisite clockwork toys suddenly made sense. They were the last remnants of a brilliant artist's stolen future. The professor paused, and she could hear him take a deep, shaky breath before he read the next entry. The date was a cold brand on her mind, December 1946. "They call me a spy, a Nazi. The irony is a poison in my throat. A joke so cruel only the devil could have written it. Abernathy has turned the town against me with his lies. They whisper when I walk by. They look at my Anya with fear in their eyes. He covets my forest, and he will use any poison to get it. He has convinced the sheriff, a weak man who feeds from his hand, that my German tongue is the tongue of an enemy." Elena felt a wave of nausea, the calculated cruelty of it. Turning a victim of the Nazis into one of their own was monstrous. It wasn't just a land grab, it was the utter annihilation of a man's identity and soul before they even came for his life. The ghost of Klaus was no longer a gentle spirit. He was a screaming, wronged soul. The final entry was short, the handwriting a frantic scrawl that the professor said was barely legible. It was a testament of pure terror. December 14th, 1946. "He is coming. I hear the sound of his trucks on the road. There is nowhere to run. I have hidden the diary and the deeds. The tears of starlight are safe, where the water is coldest and deepest, sealed from the light. May God forgive me for bringing my family to this place. My Anya, my little star." The professor's voice broke. There were no more entries. The rest of the diary was blank. The line was silent for a moment, the unspoken horror hanging between them. "Where the water is coldest and deepest." The words echoed in Elena's mind, a horrifying clue. She thought of the old, boarded up well she'd seen behind the house, a dark circle of stone choked with weeds. Her stomach clenched. She felt physically sick. The diary wasn't just a story. It was a last will and testament, written in the final moments before a murder. She hung up the phone, her hand numb, the receiver slick with sweat. The familiar, mundane sounds of the general store, the hum of the coolers, the soft chatter of the clerk, seemed to come from a great distance. The world had tilted on its axis. The house was no longer a ruin. It was a crime scene. The beautiful, silent woods surrounding it were not a sanctuary. They were a monument to a stolen legacy, built on bones and lies. The weight of this knowledge was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards in her house, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, now sounded like the whispers of Klaus and his family. Their story finally unearthed after 70 years of silence. She was no longer just a desperate mother. She was the sole inheritor of a terrible truth, a truth that a very powerful and very local family believed was buried forever. The fear was a living thing, coiling in her gut, cold and heavy as a stone. The next afternoon, a sound shattered the rural quiet, a sound so alien it felt like a violation. It was the crunch of expensive tires on the cheap gravel of her dirt road. Eleanor, who was trying to patch a hole in the roof, froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Peeking through a gap in the porch railing, she saw a car, a modern, gleaming black sedan that looked like it had been teleported from a corporate high-rise parking garage. It was spotless, predatory, and utterly out of place in this world of rust and decay. The engine purred with a quiet power that was more intimidating than any roar. A cold sweat prickled the back of her neck. She instinctively darted back inside, her mind racing. Who was it? No one knew she was here, besides the lawyer, and now the professor. A primal instinct took over. She ran to her suitcase, grabbed the diary and the deeds, and shoved them deep inside the cold, dead fireplace, behind a loose brick she had found earlier. The car door opened with a solid, expensive thud. A man emerged, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who owned the very ground he walked on. He was tall and lean, perhaps 75, dressed in a tailored tweed jacket and expensive leather boots that looked like they had never touched mud. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and a pleasant, grandfatherly smile was fixed on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were a pale, cold blue, sharp and assessing, missing nothing. He walked up the crumbling path, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated house with an expression of faint disgust. "Hello there," he called out, his voice smooth and resonant with authority. "I'm Arthur Abernathy. My family has owned the timberlands in this valley for 3 generations. The name hit Elena with the force of a physical punch. She felt the air leave her lungs. The wolf's grandson had come to her door. Eleanor forced herself to step onto the porch, her body rigid with a mixture of terror and a strange, cold fury. She kept her face a blank mask, her heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Abernathy's smile widened, but the coldness in his eyes deepened. "A pleasure. I heard the old Reinhardt place had a new resident, a surprise to us all." He gestured vaguely at the ruin around them. "Frankly, my dear Hat, this place is an eyesore, a blight on the landscape, and not safe, I'd wager." He let his eyes linger on Leo, who was peering shyly from behind Elena's legs. "I feel for you, which is why I'm here. I'd be willing to take this burden off your hands, give you, say, $5,000 for the deed, enough to get you and the boy a fresh start somewhere else." The offer was a calculated insult, a clear signal that this was not a negotiation. It was a command. $5,000. The number was so absurdly low it was a joke, a cruel, vicious joke, for the house and the land that, according to the deeds in her fireplace, was connected to a fortune. A cold, defiant anger flared in Elena's chest, momentarily burning through her fear. She met his cold gaze, her own eyes hardening. I'll have to think about it," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. Abernathy's folksy smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a tighty, thin line. The mask had slipped. "Think about it," he repeated, his voice losing its warmth, turning hard as flint. He let his gaze drift pointedly up to the sagging porch roof, then to a loose shutter banging in the wind. "Of course, take your time," he said, his voice now a low, menacing purr. "But be careful. Old houses like this, they're filled with dangers. Rotting floorboards, bad wiring, old wells. Terrible accidents can happen. It would be a real tragedy if something were to happen to a young boy in a place like this. The threat hung in the air between them, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. He gave a curt nod, turned his back on her, and walked back to his gleaming black car without another word. The engine started, and the car crunched back down the gravel road, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint, toxic smell of exhaust. Elena stood frozen on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around Leo, her body trembling uncontrollably. The encounter had confirmed her deepest fears. Abernathy knew. He didn't know what she knew, but he knew the house was a loose end, a potential threat to the criminal empire his family had built on blood and lies. She was no longer just the guardian of a dead man's secret. She was a direct threat to a living monster. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money and run, saving your child from immediate danger? Or would you stay and fight for justice, risking everything against a man who holds all the power? The silence Arthur Abernathy left behind was a physical thing, a thick, suffocating blanket woven with menace. Eleanor stood on the rotting porch, her arms locked around Leo, her knuckles white. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a violent, internal earthquake of fear that refused to subside. The grandfatherly mask had slipped, revealing the cold reptilian predator beneath. Accidents happen. The words echoed in her skull, a slick, venomous promise. Her stomach churned with a nauseating mix of terror and rage. He hadn't just threatened her, he had threatened her son. He had looked at Leo with those dead, cold eyes and marked him as acceptable collateral damage. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she tightened her grip on Leo, as if her small frame could somehow shield him from the monstrous power that now had them in its sights. The sun felt cold on her skin. The scent of pine and damp earth, once just a feature of the landscape, now smelled of secrets and graves. The entire world had become hostile territory. The house, her reluctant sanctuary, had transformed into a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the broken windows, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her system. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of bone. She felt watched. The ancient, whispering woods no longer seemed neutral. They were Abernathy's woods, his kingdom, and the trees themselves felt like silent, hostile sentinels reporting her every move. She brought Leo inside, barricading the door with a rickety chair. A futile gesture she knew was more for her own sanity than for any real protection. She felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. The isolation that had once been a source of despair was now a source of pure terror. There was no one to call. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The local sheriff was in Abernathy's pocket. They were an island, and the tide was rising, cold and black and threatening to swallow them whole. She couldn't eat. The bread she'd bought felt like sawdust in her mouth, and the thought of food made her want to gag. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of fear and fractured plans. Run. The thought was a primal scream in her head. Take Leo and run. But where? With what? Her money was almost gone. The bus ticket back to the city, back to eviction and homelessness, felt like a death sentence of a different kind. And Abernathy would know. A woman and a child leaving town so suddenly after his visit. It would be a confession. He would find them. Men like him, with their money and their power that stretched back generations, had long arms. A cold certainty settled in her stomach. Running was not an escape, it was merely a delay. He hadn't just offered to buy the land, he had issued a command. He wanted her gone, and if she wouldn't leave willingly, he would remove her. The word accident was a brand on her mind, hot and searing. The house felt like a ticking bomb. That night, sleep was a distant country she could not reach. She sat in the dark, her back pressed against the wall, listening. She held the heaviest object she could find, a rusty iron fire poker, its cold weight a small, pathetic comfort in her sweating palm. Her ears strained to decipher the house's nightly symphony, attributing every groan of timber, every skittering sound from the walls, to the approach of Abernathy's men. Was that the sound of a car engine in the distance, or just the wind? Was that a footstep on the porch, or a branch scraping against the roof? The fear was a living entity. feeding on the shadows, growing stronger with every passing hour. She felt her sanity fraying at the edges, stretched thin by a terror that was both absolute and maddeningly vague. She was a cornered animal, waiting for the hunter's blow to fall, and the waiting was a torture all its own. She could feel the ghost of Klaus Reinhardt in the room, his own terror from 70 years ago, reaching across time to find a home in her own heart. As the first weak, grey light of dawn filtered through the grime-caked windows, a fragile clarity pierced through Eleanor's fog of fear. Waiting to be a victim was not a strategy. It was a surrender. The Abernathy family had thrived for generations by isolating and intimidating their victims, crushing them one by one in the dark. Klaus Reinhardt had been alone. She was alone. That was the key. Her only hope, her only chance of survival, was to break that isolation. She had to find someone, anyone in this godforsaken valley, who was not on Arthur Abernathy's payroll. A desperate long shot, a fool's hope, but it was the only hope she had. Her mind frantically scanned the faces she had seen in town, the clerk at the store, the tired woman at the post office, all of them with eyes that were either cowed or complicit. But then she remembered something. On the long, dusty road into town, miles from her own ruin, there had been one house that was different. It was a small, unassuming cottage, but it had stood out like a diamond in a dustbin. While every other property seemed to be in some state of neglect or Abernathy-owned uniformity, this one was immaculate. The fence was freshly painted a crisp white. The garden was a riot of color, meticulously tended zinnias and roses standing in defiant opposition to the surrounding wilderness. An old-fashioned but lovingly maintained pickup truck sat in the driveway. It was the home of someone who took pride in their independence, someone who had drawn a line in the dirt and said, "This far and no further." She didn't know who lived there, but that house was a symbol. It was a sign of resistance, however small. It was the home of someone who was not afraid, or perhaps someone who had nothing left to lose. With a deep, shuddering breath, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She would take the diary, she would walk to that house, and she would pray. Leaving Leo behind was agony. She sat him at the kitchen table with a piece of bread and the last of their milk, his repaired wooden soldier standing guard beside him. "Mommy has to go talk to someone at Sweetheart. It's very important. You stay right here. Don't open the door for anyone." Her voice was a strained, false whisper of calm. The fear in his wide eyes mirrored her own, a reflection that was almost too painful to bear. She felt a surge of self-loathing. What kind of mother leaves her child alone in a death trap to go on a desperate, half-cocked mission? But the alternative, staying and waiting for Abernathy's accident to happen, was infinitely worse. This was her one slim chance to fight back. She wrapped the diary and the deeds in the same threadbare towel, the bundle feeling like a lead weight in her bag. She kissed Leo's forehead, the soft warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the ice in her own veins. "I'll be back soon," she lied, the words tasting like ash. The walk was a marathon of paranoia. Every snap of a twig in the woods beside the road made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She imagined Abernathy's men watching her from behind the dark curtain of trees, their cold eyes tracking her every move. The sun beat down on her, but she felt a deep, internal chill. The gravel road stretched out before her, a dusty ribbon leading towards either salvation or a new, more profound disaster. She clutched the strap of her bag, the hard corners of the diary pressing into her side, a constant reminder of the terrible truth she carried. She was no longer just Elena, the failed seamstress. She was a messenger, a vessel for a 70-year-old crime. She was walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a dead man's story. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and for a moment, her legs felt weak, her resolve faltering. But then she pictured Leo's face, small and trusting, and she forced herself to keep walking. She finally reached the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Up close, the impression of prideful independence was even stronger. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and roses. A man was in the garden, his back to her, kneeling as he tended to a bed of tomato plants. He was old, his back stooped with age, a straw hat shielding his head from the sun. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had worked his body hard for many, many decades. As she approached the gate, its hinges freshly oiled and silent, he looked up. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes, behind a pair of simple wire-rimmed glasses, were startlingly sharp and alert. They were not the eyes of a man who missed much. This was him. This had to be him. She felt a tremor of fear, but also a flicker of something else. Hope. It was a fragile, terrifying thing, but it was there. "Excuse me," she began, her voice a dry croak. The old man rose slowly, his knees cracking audibly in the quiet air. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt and regarded her with a steady, unblinking gaze. He didn't seem surprised to see her, a fact that was both comforting and unsettling. "Oh, you're the girl from the old Reinhardt place," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. "Heard you moved in. Name's Silver. Been delivering mail in this valley for 50 years before I retired. Now I just deliver tomatoes." His gaze was searching, penetrating. He saw the dust on her clothes, the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the raw, palpable fear she was trying so desperately to hide. He saw the way she clutched her bag, as if it contained the crown jewels. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps just pity, softened his hard features. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice dropping slightly. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. "More than one," she whispered. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured towards the house. "Well, don't stand out there frying in the sun. The porch is cool. Wife made lemonade." He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't ask why she was there. It was as if he had been expecting her, or someone like her, for a very long time. Elena felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She followed him up the porch steps, the wood solid and firm beneath her feet, a stark contrast to the rotting, treacherous boards of her own house. He settled into a rocking chair, which gave a comfortable, rhythmic creak, and gestured for her to take the other one. He poured her a glass of lemonade from a sweating pitcher, the clink of ice against glass the most normal, comforting sound she had heard in weeks. The simple act of kindness was so unexpected, it brought tears to her eyes. She fought them back, her throat tight. She didn't know where to begin. The story was so vast, so monstrous, it felt impossible to put into words. She sat in silence, the cold glass slick with condensation in her trembling hands, the tart sweetness of the lemonade, a shocking contrast to the bitterness in her soul. Mr. Silver just rocked, his gaze fixed on the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the Abernathy timberlands. He seemed to be in no hurry. He was giving her time, letting the quiet settle her frayed nerves. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Arthur Abernathy, pay you a visit yet?" The question was so direct, so knowing that it stole the breath from her lungs. She could only nod, her eyes wide. "Figured," he said, spitting a piece of grass over the railing. "He's a creature of habit, just like his father and his grandfather before him. They see something they want, they take it. They see a loose thread, they don't just pull it. They burn the whole damn garment." That was it. The opening she needed. The dam of her fear and isolation broke, and the story came pouring out of her in a torrent. She told him everything. About the eviction, the desperation, the ruin of the house. She told him about the impossibly repaired soldier, the loose stone in the basement, and the treasures hidden within. Her voice shook as she described the German diary, the clockwork toys, and the deeds to the stolen forest. She pulled the bundle from her bag and laid the diary on the small table between them, the dark leather looking ancient and sacred in the afternoon light. Mr. Silver stopped rocking. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the book, his face a mask of intense concentration. He didn't look at her. He just listened, his silence more encouraging than any words could have been. He was not just hearing her story, he was recognizing it. He was fitting it into a puzzle he had been staring at his entire life. When she finally spoke of Arthur Abernathy's visit, of his insulting offer, and his veiled, venomous threat about accidents, Mr. Silver's face hardened. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, curled into tight fists on his knees. "That's their way," he murmured, his voice a low, angry growl. "Poison and threats. They poisoned this whole valley with their greed, turned neighbor against neighbor, made good people look the other way while they stole and murdered." He finally looked at her, and the pity in his eyes had been replaced by a grim, steely resolve. "You're not crazy, girl, and you're not wrong. I was just a boy, younger than your Leo when the Reinhardts moved in. I remember him, Klaus. He had kind eyes. He gave me a small wooden bird once, a toy he'd carved. My father worked for the post office then. He said Klaus was a good man. A quiet man who just wanted to be left alone. A deep, shuddering sigh racked his old frame, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 70 years of buried truth. Everyone knew Alistair Abernathy, Arthur's grandfather, wanted that timber. It was the only patch of old growth he didn't own. When the war ended and this German fellow shows up and buys it, legal and proper, Alistair went mad. He started the rumors himself, that Klaus was a spy, a Nazi hiding out. People were scared after the war. It was an easy lie to sell. He shook his head, a look of profound, ancient sadness in his eyes. And then, one day, they were just gone. The whole family vanished. The sheriff, a man who got his job because Alistair Abernathy put him there, said they'd fled, run off in the night. Spies, he called them, proved they were enemies all along. Abernathy produced some forged papers, claiming he'd bought the land, and that was that. Case closed. The town was scared. No one asked questions. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The final pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place, forming a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. It wasn't just a land grab. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of slander, followed by murder and a massive cover-up that had implicated the entire town in its silence. "But you didn't believe it," Elena whispered, her voice full of awe. "You knew it was a lie." Mr. Silver's gaze grew distant, his eyes looking back through the long tunnel of years, back to a specific night, a specific memory that had been sealed away like a toxic secret. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't believe it, and neither did my father." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the air on the porch suddenly thick with the gravity of his words. "My father, he had the late mail run that night. The night the Reinhardts vanished, he was on the back road, the one that runs behind their property." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers, ensuring she understood the weight of what he was about to say. The rhythmic creak of the rocking chair had stopped. The only sounds were the buzz of a fly and the frantic beating of Elena's heart. He saw truck headlights in the woods by the old Reinhardt place, where they shouldn't have been. He cut his engine and watched from the trees. He saw 3 men. 2 of them were Abernathy's foreman. The third was Alistair Abernathy himself. They weren't loading anything. They were digging. The image was so stark, so horrifying, it seared itself into Elena's mind. 3 powerful men digging in the dead of night on a murdered family's land. The cold dread that had been a constant companion now solidified into a block of ice in her stomach. She knew what was coming next, but she had to hear it. She had to know the final, terrible truth. "They weren't digging a grave," Mr. Silver continued, his voice a harsh, raw whisper. "Not a new one. They were at the old well, the one behind the house. My father said the moon was bright that night. He could see the stone cover was pulled aside. He heard them grunting, the sound of something heavy being lowered into the dark. Then the scraping sound of shovels on dirt, filling something in. And then a final heavy thud as they dragged the stone cap back into place. They worked for an hour, and then they left. The next morning, the sheriff announced that the spy and his family had fled the country. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. A wave of nausea washed over her. The tears of starlight are safe, where the water is coldest and deepest, sealed from the light. The cryptic line from Klaus's diary, "The old well," it wasn't just a grave for his fortune, it was a grave for his family. The full, monstrous weight of the truth settled upon them, a suffocating presence on the sun-drenched porch. Arthur Abernathy wasn't just protecting a stolen fortune and a legacy of theft. He was protecting a mass grave, his entire empire, his family's respectability. It was all built on a foundation of human bones buried in her backyard. The threat against her and Leo wasn't just about scaring her off the land. It was about ensuring the seal on that tomb was never, ever broken. The risk she was taking was infinitely greater than she had ever imagined. Mr. Silver seemed to read the terror on her face. He reached out a gnarled, trembling hand and placed it on her arm. His touch was surprisingly firm, a grounding anchor in her sea of fear. "My father was too scared to talk," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of shame. "He had a family to protect. Abernathy would have crushed him, crushed us all, so he stayed quiet, and I stayed quiet. Until now. The alliance was sealed. In the old man's eyes, Elena saw not just the grim resolve of an ally, but the burning need for redemption. He was the guardian of the story, the last living witness to the crime's immediate aftermath. And she was the catalyst, the one who had brought the proof. Together they had the truth. But the truth was a fragile, dangerous thing, and they were up against a monster with 70 years of experience in burying it. "He knows you won't be scared off now," Mr. Silver said, his voice low and urgent. "That visit wasn't a negotiation. It was a final warning. He gave you a chance to run. You didn't take it. Now he won't make the same mistake his grandfather did. He won't leave any loose ends. He won't leave a house full of evidence standing. You and the boy are not safe there. Not for one more night." The words hung in the air, a death sentence. A cold, primal fear seized Eleanor, a fear not for herself, but for Leo. He was alone in that house, alone in that tomb. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly on the wooden porch. "Leo!" she gasped, her mind suddenly a maelstrom of horrific possibilities. "I have to get back. I have to get him." Mr. Silver was already on his feet, his slow, deliberate movements replaced by a sudden, surprising urgency. "Go," he commanded, his voice like iron. "Get the boy, and get that diary, get the deeds, get everything. Bring it all here. You'll be safe here. He wouldn't dare touch you on my property. It would be too obvious. Go now. Use the woods. Stay off the road. Hurry, girl. For God's sake, hurry." The final words were a lash, propelling her into motion. She didn't say goodbye. She just ran, her bag banging against her hip, the old man's terrifying prophecy echoing in her ears. The run back through the woods was a frantic, desperate scramble. She crashed through the undergrowth, heedless of the thorns that tore at her clothes and skin, her lungs burning, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. The woods, which had seemed menacing before, and now felt like her only shield. The canopy of leaves offered cover from prying eyes on the road. The familiar path was a blur. Her mind was a singular, screaming litany. Leo, Leo, Leo. Every shadow was a threat, every fallen branch a body. She imagined the house in flames, her son trapped inside. The thought was a physical blow, driving her to run faster, to push her exhausted body past its limits. Panic was a metallic taste in her mouth. She burst from the tree line into the overgrown clearing of her own yard, her eyes immediately seeking the house, her breath held in a silent, desperate prayer. It was still standing, silent, ominously silent. She burst through the front door, which she had left unlocked in her haste, her voice a raw, ragged cry. "Leo!" The house was quiet, too quiet. For one heart-stopping second, she thought she was too late. "Leo!" she screamed again, her voice cracking with terror. A small, frightened voice answered from the kitchen. "Mommy!" He was there. He was safe. She ran to him, scooping him up in her arms, holding him so tightly he grunted in protest. She buried her face in his hair, her body racked with shuddering, uncontrollable sobs of relief. He was safe, for now. But Mr. Silver's words echoed in her head. Not for one more night. The brief, exquisite moment of relief was immediately extinguished by a fresh wave of ice-cold urgency. They had to leave. Now. There was no time to pack, no time to think, just time to grab the evidence and run. She grabbed their single, pathetic suitcase and threw it open on the floor, her hands shaking so violently she could barely function. She retrieved the diary and the deeds from their hiding place in the fireplace, the brick scraping against her raw fingers. The papers felt brittle, the diary heavy with the weight of its secrets. This was what it was all about. This was Klaus Reinhardt's life, his legacy, his cry for justice from beyond the grave. She tucked the bundle carefully into her bag, alongside the clockwork toys that she had retrieved earlier. These small, beautiful objects were not just evidence. They were the last surviving pieces of a murdered family's soul. They were sacred. As she worked, she could feel the atmosphere in the house shifting. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of impending violence. The silence was no longer empty. It was the held breath before a scream. The house was waiting. Then she heard it. At first, it was just a low, distant hum, barely distinguishable from the whisper of the wind, but it grew steadily louder, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the soles of her feet. It was the sound of a heavy engine, a truck, moving too fast on the dirt road. Her blood turned to ice. They were here. Mr. Silver had been right. Abernathy hadn't wasted a moment. The final warning had expired. She looked at Leo, his eyes wide with a fear he didn't understand. There was no time for the door, no time for the road. Her eyes darted around the room, frantically searching for an escape. The back window, the one in the kitchen, its frame half rotted, overlooking the deepest part of the woods behind the well. It was their only chance. "Come on, baby," she whispered, her voice a tight, strangled thread of sound. "We're going to play a game, a hiding game." She grabbed Leo's hand, her other hand clutching the bag with the evidence, and dragged him towards the kitchen. The truck's engine noise was deafening now, right outside. It cut out abruptly, followed by the slam of two heavy doors. The crunch of boots on gravel, low male voices. They weren't trying to be quiet, they weren't hiding. They were here to send a message of fire and destruction. Elena's heart felt like it was going to explode. She fumbled with the rusted latch on the kitchen window, her fingers clumsy with terror. It wouldn't budge. It was painted shut, sealed by years of grime and neglect. A sob of pure frustration and fear escaped her lips. She could hear the heavy footsteps on the front porch, the groan of the wood as two heavy men stepped onto it. They were trapped. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength born of sheer maternal terror, Elena grabbed the iron fire poker she had held all night. She didn't hesitate. She swung it with all her might against the window pane. The glass exploded outwards in a shower of glittering shards, the sound a deafening crash in the small kitchen. A cold draught of night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and impending doom. At the same moment, the front door splintered, a loud crack echoing through the house as a heavy boot kicked it in. "No time!" she screamed, more to herself than to Leo. She pushed him through the broken window first, lowering him as gently as she could to the soft ground below. He landed with a small cry. "Run to the big trees, Leo! Run and hide! Don't look back!" she commanded, her voice raw with a panic that was bordering on hysteria. She tossed the bag with the precious evidence out after him, praying it wouldn't be damaged. She could hear the men inside now, their voices rough and angry, their heavy boots stomping through the main room. "Where'd they go?" one of them yelled. She scrambled to pull herself through the jagged opening, a shard of remaining glass slicing a deep, hot gash into her arm. She cried out in pain, but didn't stop. She fell to the ground outside, landing hard on her hands and knees. Ignoring the searing pain in her arm, she snatched up the bag, grabbed Leo's hand, and plunged into the absolute darkness of the woods. Behind them, a bright orange light flared to life in the kitchen window, a hungry, flickering glow that began to lick at the dry, rotten wood of the house. The smell of gasoline and smoke suddenly filled the air. They were not just here to scare her. They were here to erase her. They were burning everything. They ran. A blind, panicked flight through the tangled undergrowth. The woods that had been her shield were now a treacherous maze of grasping thorns and unseen roots that threatened to trip her at every step. Leo was sobbing, his small legs struggling to keep up. Eleanor half dragged, half carried him, her own breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The pain in her arm was a dull, throbbing fire, and she could feel warm, sticky blood soaking the sleeve of her shirt. Behind them, the fire roared, a monstrous, living beast, casting dancing, demonic shadows through the trees. The light grew brighter, turning the night into a hellish, orange-tinged day. She could hear the crackle and pop of ancient timber succumbing to the flames, the sound of her past, her temporary home, being violently obliterated. The fire was not just destroying the house, it was destroying the crime scene. She risked a single glance back. The ruin was engulfed, a raging funeral pyre against the black sky. She didn't know how long they ran. Time had dissolved into a frantic sequence of heartbeats and painful breaths. Her only guide was the memory of Mr. Silver's cottage, a single point of light in her collapsing universe. She pushed forward, driven by pure instinct, the primal need to get her child to safety. The sounds of the fire began to fade, replaced by the sound of her own frantic breathing and the pounding of her feet on the forest floor. She stumbled out of the woods and onto the edge of a familiar dirt road. In the distance she saw it, a single warm light shining from a window, a beacon in the night, the light from Mr. Silver's porch. Hope, a feeling she thought had been burned to ashes with her house, surged through her. With the last of her strength, she staggered towards it, dragging her crying child, clutching a dead man's story, leaving the ghosts and the fire behind her. Mr. Silver's front door burst open, revealing Eleanor, a wild apparition framed in the warm yellow light, her arm dripping a dark trail of blood onto the pristine floorboards. She was gasping for air, her face streaked with soot and tears, clutching Leo's hand like a lifeline. Behind her, the distant sky pulsed with a malevolent orange glow, the hungry roar of the fire a faint, monstrous echo on the wind. Mr. Silver's wife, a tiny woman with eyes as sharp as her husband's, moved with silent efficiency, whisking Leo away to the kitchen with promises of milk and cookies, while Mr. Silver guided Elena to a chair. The scent of antiseptic soon filled the air as the gash on her arm was cleaned, a sharp, clean smell that cut through the lingering stench of smoke. Mr. Silver wasted no time. He moved to an old black rotary phone on the wall, his gnarled finger dialing a long-remembered number with grim determination. His voice was a low, urgent murmur, a cascade of hushed words into the receiver, bypassing a generation of corruption to reach for true justice. By dawn, two unmarked sedans, their clean lines and dark-tinted windows, a stark contrast to the valley's rural decay, crunched to a halt in front of Mr. Silver's cottage. A woman in a sharply tailored suit, her expression one of intense, focused intelligence, emerged from the first car. This was State Prosecutor Diane Chen. From the second car stepped a man with restless eyes and a camera slung over his shoulder, an investigative journalist from the capital whose reputation for toppling corrupt empires preceded him. They gathered around Mr. Silver's small kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of strong coffee and 70 years of unspoken truth. Elena, her arm bandaged and her voice hoarse, laid out the evidence, the leather-bound diary, its German script, a testament to a stolen life, the original deeds, their brittle paper a death sentence for the Abernathy legacy, the intricate clockwork toys, silent, beautiful witnesses to a murdered artist's genius. Her story, interwoven with Mr. Silver's solemn eyewitness testimony, painted a picture so monstrous it left the room in stunned silence. The arm of legitimate justice, once unleashed, moved with breathtaking speed. A fleet of state police cruisers and forensic vans descended upon the valley, a formidable display of power that shattered the town's decades-long paralysis of fear. Federal warrants were served, while one team swarmed the opulent Abernathy timber headquarters, seizing computers and file cabinets filled with generations of fraudulent documents. Another team established a perimeter around the smoking Anchi, blackened ruins of Elena's house. The air, heavy with the acrid smell of burnt wood and shattered dreams, now also carried the purposeful shouts of investigators and the deep, mechanical groan of an excavator being moved into position. Its heavy steel bucket was poised over the old weed-choked stone well, ready to dig into the cold, damp earth and unearth a secret the Abernathy family had killed to protect. The town watched from a distance, a collective breath held in anticipation of the truth they had all, on some level, always known was buried there. The excavator's bucket bit into the earth, tearing away layers of soil and rock that had sealed the well for decades. The work was slow, methodical, a careful archaeological dig rather than a brute-force demolition. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky. Then the bucket scraped against something solid, a sound that made everyone freeze. Investigators descended into the pit, their hands carefully brushing away the dirt. They uncovered the edges of a large, metal-banded chest, its surface blackened with age and moisture, but miraculously intact. Heavy chains were attached, and with a groan of straining machinery, the chest was hoisted from its earthen tomb and lowered gently onto a tarp. The prosecutor nodded, and an officer used a pry bar on the rusted locks. They gave way with a shriek of protesting metal. As the heavy lid was lifted, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled team. Inside, nestled on a bed of rotted fabric, lay a breathtaking fortune in uncut diamonds, catching the sunlight and exploding into 1,000 points of fiery, brilliant light. The discovery of the diamonds was a triumph, but the excavation was not over. Below the space where the chest had rested, the investigators found a second, darker layer. Carefully, with brushes and trowels, they began to uncover the fragile, earth-stained shapes of human bones. It was a jumble of remains, a testament to the hurried, violent nature of their disposal. They found the skeleton of a man and a woman, and then, most horribly, the tiny, delicate skeleton of a small child. Anya, Klaus Reinhardt's little star, her light extinguished in this cold, dark hole. The journalist, his face a grim mask, silently raised his camera, the flash capturing the irrefutable, horrific proof of the Abernathy crime. Mr. Silver, who had stood watching in stoic silence all day, finally broke. A single tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek, a 70-year-old burden of silence and guilt finally finding release. The ghosts of the Reinhardt family, trapped for so long in the cold earth, could now cry out for justice. Their silent screams finally heard. The arrest was a quiet, clinical affair that spoke of absolute confidence. 2 state police cars rolled silently up the long, manicured driveway of the Abernathy mansion, their tires barely making a sound on the expensive gravel. Arthur Abernathy was on his veranda, enjoying his morning coffee, the very picture of untouchable, generational power. He watched the cars approach with mild annoyance, which turned to confusion and then to a flash of cold and reptilian fury as Prosecutor Chen and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. She didn't speak. She simply handed him the warrant, which detailed charges of murder, fraud, and arson. The color drained from his face as he read it. The mask of the respected town patriarch dissolved, revealing the cornered, aging monster beneath. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was the only sound in the morning air, a final, damning punctuation mark on a story of blood and greed. As they led him away, his powerful frame suddenly looked shrunken and pathetic, his empire collapsing around him in silence. The trial was a media sensation, a story of buried treasure, family secrets, and monstrous injustice that captivated the nation. Elena, no longer the terrified, destitute woman who had arrived in the valley with nothing, took the stand. Her voice was steady, her gaze clear, as she recounted her story, her testimony weaving together the threads of the diary, the deeds, and the final, horrific discovery in the well. The Abernathy Empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled under the weight of the truth. Arthur Abernathy was convicted on all charges and would spend the rest of his life in prison. The courts, in a landmark ruling, invalidated the Abernathy family's fraudulent claim to the land. The hundreds of acres of resource-rich forest, along with the recovered diamonds, were legally awarded to Elena as the last surviving heir to the Reinhardt legacy. She had not only found justice for Klaus and his family, she had inherited the kingdom he had dreamed of building for his own daughter. 1 year later, the scarred, blackened patch of land was unrecognizable. Where the ruin had stood, there now rose a beautiful modern house of glass and cedar, its large windows drinking in the sunlight. The air no longer smelled of rot and decay, but of fresh-cut lumber, baking bread, and the sweet perfume of 1,000 flowers blooming in meticulously tended gardens. Inside, in a spacious studio filled with bolts of vibrant silk and linen, Elena sat at a state-of-the-art sewing machine. The steady, happy hum of its engine was a sound of pure creation, a world away from the desperate factory work she had left behind. She was designing a line of children's clothing, her hands, once raw from poverty and fear, now moving with the confident grace of an artist. She had found her own craft, her own purpose in the house that had been built on the ashes of another artist's dream. The transformation was absolute, a life not just repaired, but remade from the ground up, stronger and more beautiful than before. Leo's laughter echoed through the sprawling yard, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He had his own room, a new bicycle, and a dozen friends from the newly revitalized town. He was happy, safe, and loved. The shadows of their past life a distant, fading memory. On the hand-carved mantelpiece in the living room, in a place of honor, stood the small wooden soldier. Its crimson uniform was still bright, its painted smile still perfect. It was a constant, quiet reminder of the impossible moment when their luck had turned, the first whisper from a ghost who had refused to be forgotten. That evening, Eleanor served a lavish dinner, the long wooden table groaning under the weight of roast chicken, fresh vegetables from her garden, and a decadent chocolate cake. As she looked at Leo's smiling face, bathed in the warm glow of the dining room, she felt a peace so profound it was a physical presence. The frantic, terrified bird in her heart was finally still, its long, desperate flight over at last. Eleanor never forgot the man who had made it all possible. With her newfound resources, she established the Reinhardt Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal aid to people fighting against corporate land theft and historical injustices. She had turned her own terrifying journey into a beacon of hope for others, ensuring that Klaus Reinhardt's name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a symbol of enduring justice. His spirit, the quiet, brilliant toymaker, had not only saved her and her son, but had sparked a movement that would save countless others. Her story, and his, is a testament to the fact that, even in the darkest of places, secrets cannot stay buried forever, and a single voice, armed with the truth, can topple an empire. What hidden strengths do you have, waiting for a crisis to bring them to light? If you believe that stories of justice and redemption deserve to be heard, subscribe to our channel for more tales of the unbreakable human spirit.